Most wood shops will have one or more sanders in it simply because it saves a lot of time. Also, when you're cutting things down, if you have an odd shape that you need to cut, the best way to save time is to cut it out, leaving a little bit of that line so that you can sand it down. The bandsaw does not leave a good edge. So we have these sanders to save you time, to give you a better product after you're done. So we have 3 of them in the shop, 3 different machines. This one happens to be a combination of a disc and a belt sander. We have a drum or oscillating spindle sander, and we have a horizontal belt sander, or sometimes it's called an edge sander. We're going to talk about all 3 of them a little bit. Some of the basics of these sanders is that you want to make sure to sand in a way that not only is safe, but will keep the belt from getting ripped or torn. As you're sanding, make sure to keep your board flat on the table. We don't want to take a piece of wood and just start hogging away our image. So if you have something, make sure to cut it out, but you never want to just put it in your hand, put it in the sander while freehanding it, holding it, or if I'm on this one, it's the same thing, just holding it up off the table and going for it and around. Not only could you get a knuckle into the sander very easily, a finger or knuckle, get it sucked down between the table and the sanding belt, which I've seen before, you could rip the belt, injure yourself, the piece could go flying, and you just don't know what's going to happen. So the safest position to hold boards while using any sander is got to be braced somewhere. It's got to be down on this table, down on the table, so I can pivot around. And even if I'm doing an edge, I can pivot it around this way. If I'm doing a face, which we only do in certain circumstances, I still can pivot upward. It's still braced on something. The disc sander is probably the most aggressive one that I have in my shop. And as you can see, all it does is it just spins around. Now, depending on how this machine is wired, it could spin this way. I've seen them spinning either direction. This one has an arrow on top, so you can tell it's going this direction. However, make sure the rule is to remember the rule of always sand on the downward side of the disc. So only from the center to this side. In this case, it happens to be on the left. Because it's going down, it's going to take your sawdust and actually push it down into the exhaust system and take it out, the vacuum. Now, if I'm sanding on this side where it's going up, if I hold my board tight to the table, at the very least, all the sawdust is coming up and into my face. If I lose my grip, it's going to take the board and lift it up off the table and possibly throw it into your face as well. So be careful to use the downward side of the disc. As I'm sanding, if I sand in one spot too long, you're going to get a burn. This is a good example. You can see one has already been forming on this disc right here. A burn simply means all of the grit has been removed, and all the friction now is turning the paper dark brown, and now it doesn't sand anymore right here. This can happen on any sanding belt by pushing too hard or just by sanding in one spot. So as you're sanding, make sure to move left and right a little bit within the zone that's safe, the downward side. If I want to take off a little bit less material, then I want to sand on the inside of this disc. The further out that I go on the disc, the faster and more aggressive it's going to sand. So depending on where you want to be, how much you want to remove, make sure you know where to go. The further out I go, it's going to be more aggressive. Inside, it's going to be a little bit less aggressive. On this small belt sander in the same machine, you're going to have exactly the same rules. Keep this down tight and try not to sand in one spot of the belt. Now this one's going to be much less aggressive, and it doesn't have an area that's coming up. So no matter where I'm sanding, it's going downward, which is good, but it's not going to take off as much wood by sanding in this area. No matter where I go, it's going to be the same rate of removing wood. This drum sander or spindle sander is used mainly to sand inside curves. It's the only one that is specific to only do inside curves. So as you can see down here on the side, I've got multiple spindles depending on the diameter that you need. Now, how do you know which one to grab? You want to grab the drum or spindle that is closest to the diameter of the curve that you want to sand. Simply hold your board up to each one and find the one that still fits inside. You don't want it bigger, but as close to that diameter as possible. Simply loosen the old drum with the wrenches, unscrew it, Put the new one in and tighten it down only by hand. The machine spinning self-tightens, so you don't need to crank it down with the wrenches. In addition, make sure you put the correct ring. There are multiple rings down here for different sizes, so make sure the right one is in. This is the biggest one, it doesn't have a ring. As you're sanding, make sure that it's down flat on the table like we talked about before, and then slowly go in and turn with it as you're going along left and right. Be careful not to lose control or it's going to flip out of your hand. Now, as you can see, I'm only sanding on the bottom little bit of this drum. I also have a table that's meant to use the upper portion. So now I can do the same thing. If that gets really old at the bottom and doesn't sand anymore, then I can use the upper area and continue sanding. Now again, as you can see, now I'm using kind of the upper section and this part is barely being touched. If you want to use a little bit of the center that may be a little more fresh, simply flip this board over, put it back in carefully, and now I can use that area as well. On our edge sander, you can see that one side, the table is flat, and it leaves me the most amount of sandpaper to sand taller, bigger things. I cannot change or alter the height of this table. It stays straight and flat, so it gives me the most. As opposed to the other side of the table, which I have tilted. And the idea of this one is that it allows me, if I'm sanding flat pieces, to be able to use more of the belt. So if this part down here is getting worn, I can move my piece up and use more of the higher part of the belt. That way it can wear out more evenly. When the machine is running, the belt, if you're looking from the very top, is going clockwise. So it's going this direction. And when I put my boards in, I need to be very, very careful, especially with narrower boards like this. This is fairly narrow, that as I'm sanding, the belt's going to want to grab this corner and flip it this direction. Should that happen, it could fly out and hit somebody off to the side, or the corner could easily dig into this belt and tear it. Now, if you ever get any rips or tears in any of the disc sander, the belt, the drum sander, doesn't matter, please tell the instructor so that we can fix it. One little rip here, the next person that hits it could easily tear it off and the whole belt will shred. Now, on that point of it grabbing your board, if this board is any shorter than, say, about 10 to 12 inches, and this is not 10 or 12, then simply slide it down to my stop. This stop is put in so it's exactly 90 degrees to the belt. That way I can rest it against here and push it in without the fear of it flipping out. The reason that this machine is called an edge sander is because it's great for your outside edges. We ran the board through the wide belt sander to sand the faces. That took off the marks from the planer. But how about the ends and edge from the table saw or the jointer? If you look really close, you can see little ripples all along the edge. Now, they're not bad, but we still want to get rid of them because they'll show up more when we run it, when we spray it. On the ends, we have this end grain, these little tiny straws, if you will, that are rough to the touch. We want them to be smoother. Now, how do I know if I'm sanding enough? That's why I have a pencil. Simply do what we did for the wide belt sander. Put a little bit of graphite on there along the edges and then sand it down. When all those pencil marks are gone, you can see the difference and feel it. I've got a little bit left right there, but the rest of it is nice and smooth like glass. It works great for your doors as well. You're doing the same thing. Since this door is more than 12 inches, I can easily keep it stable as I'm sanding. That allows me to use more of the belt.